The first snowflake hit Ingrid Larsson's cheek on October 14, 1873, 3 weeks earlier than any storm had arrived in the Bitterroot Valley in living memory. She stood outside her cabin near Stevensville, Montana Territory, watching the sky turned. The color of an old bruise. Her husband, Henrik, had been dead 7 months. Her nearest neighbor lived for miles east and beneath her feet, hidden under a teen of pine planking and compacted earth, sat something that would divide her small community, and then save half of it. The temperature dropped 23 in 2 hours. Henrik had called her foolish when she'd started digging the previous spring. "We've got a root cellar already," he'd said, pointing to the conventional dugout 30 feet from their cabin. "Why dig another hole that'll just fill with groundwater?" But Ingrid had grown up in the mountains of western Norway, where her grandfather had shown her how the old family survived winters that buried entire villages. She didn't argue with Henrik. She just kept digging while he worked their 40-acre claim, removing buckets of earth one at a time through a trapdoor she'd cut into their cabin floor, directly beneath the heavy oak table Henrik's father had hauled from Wisconsin. Nobody else in Stevensville built cellars under their homes. The practice seemed wasteful, even dangerous. What if the whole structure collapsed? But Ingrid remembered her grandfather's words: "The house protects the cellar. The cellar protects the house. They're not separate things." By the time Henrik died from a timber accident in March, she'd excavated a space 8 feet deep, 12 feet long, and 9 feet wide. She'd shored up the walls with riverstone she'd gathered herself, fitting each piece without mortar, the way her grandfather had taught her. She'd built a ventilation system using hollow logs that ran up through the cabin walls, disguised as structural posts. And she'd created a secondary entrance, a horizontal tunnel just 3 feet high that ran 16 feet from the cellar to a concealed opening in the hillside behind the cabin, covered by a door made of packed sod and native grasses that you couldn't see unless you knew exactly where to look. Thomas Brennan, who homesteaded in the valley since 1867, told her she was wasting her time. "Ground freezes 5 feet down here, Mrs. Larsson," he'd said last June, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands. "Any cellar that deep is just asking for cave-ins. I've seen 3 collapse in 6 years, and 2 of them took good men with them." Brennan had served as an army engineer before settling in Montana. His skepticism carried weight. She listened politely and kept building. Mary Stoltz, who ran the general store in town, had different concerns. "It's not proper, Ingrid," she'd said in July, her German accent still thick after 12 years in America. A woman alone digging under her home like some kind of she'd stopped herself. But Ingrid knew what she'd almost said, like some kind of animal. "What will people think?" "They'll think what they want," Ingrid replied. "They always do." But it was Samuel Chen who'd offered the sharpest criticism. Chen had come to Montana in 1865 after 3 years working on the Transcontinental Railroad. He'd saved enough to buy a small parcel near town, where he operated a carpentry shop that produced the finest cabinet work in the territory. He understood construction in ways most settlers didn't. When he'd examined Ingrid's work in August, he'd run his hand along the stone walls and shaken his head. "So without mortar won't hold in a quake," he'd said quietly. "One good shake and these walls fold inward. I've seen it happen in California. Killed for people. We don't get earthquakes here," Ingrid had answered. "You don't get them until you do." Chen had replied. The fourth skeptic was Reverend Marcus Webb, a former seminary professor from Boston who'd come west in 1870 to serve the growing settlement. Webb had degrees from Harvard and had published 2 books on agricultural practices. Before accepting his posting, he'd visited Ingrid in September, bringing fresh bread from his wife. "I admire your industry, Mrs. Larsson," he'd said carefully, "but I've studied the soil composition in this region. The high water table makes underground construction extremely problematic. You're fighting geology itself. It's admirable stubbornness, but it's still stubbornness." She thanked him for the bread and returned to her work. By October, she'd completed everything. The cellar stayed at a constant 52 F, even when the cabin above reached 85. She'd installed wooden shelving along 3 walls already stocked. with preserved vegetables, smoked venison, and 63 mason jars of various preserves. She'd lined the earth and floor with gravel for drainage, and built a raised wooden platform for sleeping if necessary. The ventilation system worked perfectly. Fresh air flowed in through the northern shaft, stale air exited through the southern one, and the temperature differential created a gentle circulation that kept the space from becoming stagnant. The hidden exterior entrance remained her secret. Even the skeptics didn't know about that. Now, watching the October sky darken, Ingrid felt vindication she hadn't asked for and didn't particularly want. The storm coming wasn't ordinary. She'd seen this color before in Norway, the winter she turned 8. That storm had lasted for days and left snowdrifts higher than a man's head. 3 families had died, frozen in their homes when their fuel ran out and they couldn't reach their wood piles. The wind shifted from the northwest. Temperature was dropping through 40 now. She spent the next 2 hours preparing, moving methodically through tasks she'd rehearsed in her mind 100 times. She carried additional firewood into the cabin, enough for 3 days if she rationed carefully. She filled every container with water from the well. She checked the ventilation shafts, making sure they were clear. She moved blankets, her late husband's winter coat, a lantern, matches, and her rifle into the cellar. She hauled down additional food supplies, including a cloth sack with 15 pounds of flour, a tin of lard, and a precious half-pound of coffee. By 4 o'clock, the first real snow was falling. By 5, she couldn't see the barn 40 feet away. By 6 o'clock, the temperature had dropped to 19 and was still falling. The knock on her door came at 7:15. She almost didn't hear it over the wind, but then it came again, frantic pounding that made the whole door shake. She grabbed her rifle and opened it to find Mary Stoltz, standing there covered in snow, her face raw with wine burn. Behind her stood her 2 children, Wilhelm, aged 9, and Anna, aged 6, both shaking so hard their teeth clattered. Our cabin. Mary gasped. The chimney collapsed. Smoke everywhere. We can't stay there. Thomas Brennan's place is too far in this. I thought. I hoped. She stopped, breath coming in ragged pulls. Please. Ingrid pulled them inside without a word, shut the door against the storm, and started heating water for tea. The children huddled by the fireplace while Mary explained between shuddering breaths. They'd been preparing supper when they heard the crack. The chimney had fractured, probably from thermal stress, the stone expanding and contracting, and dumped half a ton of rock and snow down into their fireplace. The cabin had filled with smoke in minutes. They barely grabbed their coats before running outside into what was rapidly becoming a full blizzard. How long do you think this will last? Mary asked, wrapping her hands around a cup of tea. Ingrid looked out the window at solid white. Could be hours, could be days. Days? Mary's voice went tight. We don't have supplies for days. I do. By midnight, the temperature outside had dropped to -12 F. The wind was hitting sustained speeds of 47 miles per hour with gusts probably exceeding 60. Snow was accumulating at a rate of 3 an hour. The cabin shuddered with each gust, and Ingrid could hear objects, possibly sections of her barn roof, tearing loose and tumbling across the frozen ground. At 2 in the morning, another knock came. This time it was Samuel Chen, supporting Thomas Brennan, who'd badly sprained his ankle trying to reach his own barn to feed his livestock. They'd been attempting to get to Brennan's cabin when they'd seen the dim glow of Ingrid's window. Through the storm, Brennan's face was gray with pain and cold. His left boot was split along the side where his ankle had swollen. I know what you're thinking, Brennan said through clenched teeth, as Ingrid helped him to a chair, that I'm getting what I deserve for doubting you. I'm thinking your ankle needs wrapping and you need to get warm, Ingrid replied. The rest doesn't matter, but it did matter in a way neither of them could have anticipated, because at 4 in the morning, when the real fury of the storm arrived, when the temperature dropped to -28 and the wind reached 70 miles per hour, Ingrid's cabin started coming apart. The first sound was a crack like a rifle shot. A support beam in the northern wall, stressed beyond its capacity, split lengthwise. The wall didn't collapse, but it bowed inward by 6 in, and suddenly, cold air was pouring through gaps in the timber. Within minutes, the interior temperature dropped from 68 to 45. Ingrid moved fast. She gathered everyone, Mary, her two children, Brennan and Chen, and told them to grab blankets, food, anything essential. When Brennan asked where they were going, she just said, down. She lifted the trapdoor beneath the oak table. Mary stared at the ladder descending into darkness. You built this? Yes, under your floor. That's generally where under means. Chen was already helping Brennan toward the opening. How deep? 8 feet. There's room for all of us. And it'll hold temperature even if the cabin above us completely fails. They descended into the stone-walled chamber while the storm raged overhead. Ingrid came down last, pulling the trapdoor closed above them and sliding the wooden bolt into place. The temperature in the cellar was steady at 52. The ventilation shafts were still functioning. She could feel the gentle movement of air. The lantern cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. And for the first time in hours, the sound of the wind became muffled, distant, almost abstract. Mother of God, Brennan whispered, looking round. You built all this yourself? Henrik helped before he died, but mostly, yes. Chen was examining the stonework, running his hands along the walls the same way he had months earlier. But his expression now was different. These joints, he said quietly. You cut each stone to fit its neighbors. No mortar needed because the weight distribution is perfect. This is Norwegian dry stack masonry. I've read about it but never seen it. My grandfather's work. Ingrid said he built houses that stood for 300 years for the next 18 hours. They lived in that underground room. While the storm tried to kill them, they could hear the cabin above them groaning, could hear objects tearing loose and smashing against the walls. At one point, something massive, possibly a section of the barn, slammed into the northern side of the cabin with enough force that dust rained down from the ceiling boards. The children cried. Mary prayed in German. Brennan sat with his injured ankle elevated, watching the stone walls with the expression of a man reassessing his entire understanding of engineering. Chen barely spoke, but Ingrid noticed him measuring angles with his eyes, estimating load distribution, studying how she'd position the support timbers. Maybe you're wondering if you should stick around for what happens next. Trust me when I tell you this storm gets worse before it gets better. And what Ingrid built down in that darkness becomes the difference between 5 people seeing another sunrise or becoming another tragic footnote in Montana Territory history. If you value this kind of knowledge, the old techniques that kept people alive before we had weather apps and emergency services, consider subscribing. We're documenting the forgotten skills that built this country, one story at a time. The storm peaked at 6 o'clock the following evening, 35 hours after it began. The temperature outside reached 37. Snow accumulation exceeded 43 in. Wind gusts hit 80 miles per hour. 3 cabins in the Bitterroot Valley collapsed completely. 7 people died from exposure trying to reach neighboring homesteads. Livestock froze standing up in their pens in Ingrid's cellar. The temperature never dropped below 50. They rationed food carefully. Ingrid had enough stored for several weeks if necessary, but she divided everything evenly, giving the children slightly larger portions. They ate cold biscuits with honey, preserved apples, strips of dried venison. They drank water from the container she'd stored below. Brennan couldn't walk on his ankle. So Chen fashioned a splint from 2 pieces of wood and some strips of cloth, torn from an old shirt. Mary's daughter, Anna, asked questions constantly. Why doesn't it get cold down here like upstairs? Where does the air come from? How did you dig this all by yourself? Ingrid answered each one patiently, explaining thermal mass, convection currents, the principle of earth-sheltered construction. The girl listened with the fierce attention of someone whose life had just been saved by knowledge she didn't previously possess. On the second day underground, Reverend Webb arrived. Ingrid heard the scraping first, something moving in the horizontal tunnel that led from the hillside to the cellar. She grabbed her rifle and positioned herself between the sound and the others. The concealed door at the tunnel's end opened inward, and Webb crawled through, covered in snow and ice, his face blue with cold. I saw your smoke had stopped. He gasped, thought you might be in trouble, found the tunnel entrance by pure luck, fell into the hillside looking for shelter. He collapsed onto the floor, shaking violently. Chen and Mary wrapped him in blankets while Ingrid heated broth over a small spirit burner. She kept for emergencies. As Webb gradually warmed, he looked round the cellar with an expression. Ingrid recognized the look of a scholar confronting data that contradicted his theories. I was wrong, he said finally, about the water table, about the soil, about all of it. You were working from different assumptions, Ingrid replied. This technique isn't in your books because it comes from somewhere books don't reach. Webb sipped his broth, his academic mind visibly processing the thermal mass of the Earth itself. The stone walls distributing the structural load, the ventilation preventing carbon dioxide buildup, the hidden entrance providing emergency arrests. This isn't just a root cellar, this is a survival system. It's what my grandfather called a refuge room. Every farmhouse in his valley had one. They didn't build houses with cellars. They built cellars with houses on top. The storm finally broke. On the third day, the wind stopped first, then the snow, and finally the temperature began its slow crawl back towards survivable. When they emerged through the trapdoor into Ingrid's cabin, they found destruction everywhere. The northern wall had partially collapsed. Snow had drifted for feet deep through gaps in the timber. Every window was blown out. The roof had lost perhaps 30% of its shingles. Frost coated every surface. But the cabin was still standing. The oak table hadn't moved, and beneath it, the entrance to the cellar remained perfectly intact. Outside, the landscape looked like another planet. Snowdrifts reached the eaves of buildings. Trees were snapped in half. Ingrid's barn had lost its entire roof, but they were alive. All 6 of them had survived a storm that had killed 7 others within 10 miles. Brennan stood in the ruined cabin, leaning on a crutch Chen had made from a broken chair leg, staring at the trapdoor. I built fortifications in the army, he said quietly. Designed bunkers that were supposed to withstand artillery. But I never thought about building down for weather. I never considered that the biggest threat out here isn't other people, it's the sky itself. Mary was holding her children, tears running down her face. You saved my babies, she said to Ingrid. I called you foolish. I called you improper. And you saved my babies. You would have done the same, Ingrid replied. No, Mary said. I wouldn't have known how. Over the next week, as the valley dug out from the storm, something shifted in Stevensville. People started asking Ingrid questions about her cellar design. Chen made detailed drawings, annotating them with measurements and load calculations. Brennan, still hobbling on his injured ankle, began planning a similar system for his own homestead. Reverend Webb wrote a letter to his former colleagues at Harvard, describing the construction technique and its applications for frontier survival. But it was Mary who made the most dramatic change. She sold her damaged cabin to a late-arriving settler and used the money to buy the parcel adjacent to Ingrid's property. Together, working through the winter and into spring, they built a new cabin, this one with a cellar already dug beneath it, following Ingrid's design, but adapted for Mary's larger family. Wilhelm, Mary's son, worked alongside them, learning to fit stones without mortar, to calculate ventilation ratios, to think about buildings not as shelters perched on the earth, but as integrated systems working with it. By May of 1874, 7 homesteads in the Bitterroot Valley had begun construction on underground refuge rooms. Chen adapted the technique for the different soil conditions on his property, adding drainage systems that prevented water accumulation. Brennan, combining his army engineering background with Ingrid's Norwegian methods, designed a standardized version that could be built by inexperienced settlers in 6 weeks with basic tools. The following winter was mild, and some people abandoned their cellar projects halfway through. But those who'd lived through that October storm, who'd felt the temperature drop to -37, who'd heard the wind hit 80 miles per hour, who'd watched structures they'd trusted with their lives simply disintegrate, those people kept building. They understood what most settlers didn't, that surviving on the frontier wasn't about being tough or stubborn. It was about being smarter than the weather, and the weather was very, very smart. In 1876, another massive storm hit western Montana. This one lasted 5 days and dropped 61 inches of snow. Temperatures reached -42. 13 people died in the broader region, but in Stevensville, where 18 homesteads now had earth-sheltered refuge rooms, the death toll was 0. Families rode out the storm underground, emerging when it passed, to find their surface structures damaged, but their lives intact. Ingrid's original cellar became something of a local landmark. Settlers traveling through the valley would sometimes ask to see it, the way tourists might visit a monument. She'd show them the stone walls, explain the ventilation system, demonstrate how the hidden entrance worked. Some listened carefully and took notes. Others just stared, unable to reconcile the gentle-spoken Norwegian widow with the sophisticated engineering achievement beneath her cabin. She never charged anyone for the information. Knowledge that saved lives she believed belonged to everyone who needed it. In 1882, a journalist from a San Francisco newspaper came to interview her. He heard about the underground homesteads of Montana and wanted to document the phenomenon. Ingrid spoke with him for 3 hours, explaining not just how to build a refuge room, but why, the thermal principles, the load distribution, the psychology of having a truly secure space when the world above became uninhabitable. The article was published in September of that year. It included detailed diagrams and spread the technique to other frontier regions. Facing similar challenges, by 1885, earth-sheltered cellars were being built in Wyoming, the Dakotas, and northern Minnesota. The designs varied. Some used brick instead of stone, others incorporated clay walls or timber cribs. But the core principle remained constant. Build down, work with the earth, create refuge before you need it. When I first started researching this story, I expected to find a simple tale of survival. What I found instead was a case study in how knowledge transfers across cultures and time, how a technique developed in Norwegian mountains found its way to Montana valleys, adapted there by a widow, refined by a Chinese carpenter, spread by a German shopkeeper, validated by a Boston academic, and ultimately saved lives across the American West. That's the kind of legacy worth preserving. If you believe these stories matter, if you think the wisdom of builders like Ingrid Larsen deserves to be remembered and shared, subscribe to this channel. Help us document the techniques that got our grandparents through winters that would kill most of us today. Ingrid Larsen lived in that cabin until 1891, when she sold it to a young couple from Ohio and moved to Missoula to live with Mary Stoltz, whose children had grown and left for college. The cabin changed hands several times over the following decades, but the cellar remained. Homeowners would discover it, sometimes with surprise, sometimes with a vague awareness that there's something under the floor that the previous owner mentioned. In 1963, the property was purchased by a retired geology professor named Robert Tillman, who intended to subdivide it for development. During a routine survey, his crew discovered the cellar and called him to the site. Tillman descended into the space and found the stone walls still intact after 90 years, the ventilation shafts still functional, the structural integrity completely sound. He altered his development plans, preserving the cabin and cellar as a historical site. His report on the construction, published in a regional archaeology journal in 1967, noted that the technique represented a sophisticated understanding of geothermal principles and structural engineering that exceeded contemporary American frontier standards. Modern analysis of the design found that Ingrid's ventilation system created a natural air circulation rate of approximately 8 complete air exchanges per hour, the same rate recommended for contemporary underground bunkers by the Department of Defense. The refuge room principle itself has seen renewed interest in recent years as climate change makes extreme weather more frequent and severe. Architects studying disaster-resilient housing have begun incorporating earth sheltering and thermal mass concepts that would have been familiar to Ingrid Larsen. The difference is that now we call it passive survivability design and published papers about it in peer-reviewed journals. In 1873, They just called it not dying. Thomas Brennan wrote in his diary dated November 4, 1873. 3 weeks after the storm, I have spent my life believing that engineering was about imposing human will upon nature, that the role of the builder was to construct barriers strong enough to withstand whatever the world might throw at them. Mrs. Wilson taught me something different. She taught me that the best engineering works with nature, not against it. That the earth itself properly understood is not an enemy to be conquered, but an ally to be recruited. I am 61 years old and I am learning to build again from scratch. It is humbling. It is necessary. Samuel Chen's approach was more practical. He began teaching classes in Stevensville, showing other settlers how to assess soil conditions, how to prevent water intrusion, how to calculate load-bearing requirements for different wall heights. His students built 17 successful refugee rooms between 1874 and 1878, when he died in 1889. His obituary in the Stevensville Register noted that more lives were saved by his patience as a teacher than might have been lost in any single disaster. He understood that survival knowledge, like any knowledge, must be passed forward or it dies with those who carry it. Mary Stoltz became perhaps the most vocal advocate for the technique. She spoke at church gatherings, women's auxiliary meetings, and civic assemblies about the storm and what had saved her family. She was particularly emphatic about the role of traditional knowledge about how techniques dismissed as old-fashioned or impractical often contained wisdom that book learning couldn't match. My education told me that modern American methods were superior to everything that came before, she said in an 1877 speech that was later printed in the town newspaper. The storm taught me that modern just means recently invented, and recently invented doesn't mean better, it just means newer. Ingrid's grandfather knew things about surviving winter that Harvard professors didn't. That's not a criticism of Harvard, that's just a fact about knowledge. Reverend Webb went further. He began collecting oral histories from immigrant settlers, documenting the techniques and wisdom they'd brought from their original homes. His archive, now held by the Montana Historical Society, contains detailed descriptions of construction methods from Norway, Germany, Italy, Poland, Russia, and China, all adapted for Montana conditions. His introduction to the collection, written in 1885, states, "The frontier is not merely a place where civilizations meet the wilderness. It is a laboratory where different civilizations meet each other, where techniques from disparate cultures are tested against common challenges, where the best solutions survive regardless of their origin. This is democracy in its truest form, the democracy of efficacy." The cabin itself still stands. It's owned now by the Montana Historical Society and operates as a museum for 3 months each summer. Visitors can descend into the cellar, can see the stone walls that saved 5 lives on that October night in 1873, can touch the ventilation shafts that still function after more than a century. The hidden entrance through the hillside has been restored and is maintained as Ingrid built it. A grass-covered door that you'd walk past a dozen times without noticing. On the wall of the main cabin, there's a photograph of Ingrid taken in 1889, 2 years before she left the property. She's standing in front of the cabin, a small woman in a dark dress, her face weathered by 16 Montana winters. Her eyes direct and unsilencing. She holds no tools, wears no symbols of her achievement. She looks like 10,000 other frontier women in 10,000 other photographs from that era, anonymous, ordinary, unremarkable, except that beneath her feet, invisible in the photograph, but absolutely present, lies a stone-walled room that changed how an entire region thought about survival. A room built by a widow who'd listened to her grandfather's stories and trusted that wisdom earned in Norwegian mountains might work in Montana valleys. A room that saved 5 lives in its first month of existence and inspired designs that saved dozens more over the following decade. The museum placard tells visitors that Ingrid Larson built an emergency shelter, but that understates what she actually did. She translated knowledge across continents and generations. She proved that traditional techniques could adapt to new. Environments, she created a community resource from private labor. She taught through example that survival wasn't about individual toughness, but collective wisdom. And she did it all while being called foolish, improper, and wasteful by people who should have known better but didn't, at least not yet. That's the detail I keep coming back to. Not that she built something remarkable, though she did, but that she built it despite universal skepticism from people whose opinions carried real weight. Brennan had engineering credentials, Chen had construction expertise, Webb had academic training, Mary represented community standards. All of them doubted her, and all of them were wrong. And all of them had the humility to admit it when the evidence came in. That kind of intellectual honesty is rarer than good engineering. It's worth documenting. It's worth remembering. It's worth sharing with anyone who will listen. If this story resonated with you, if you found value in learning how a Norwegian technique saved Montana lives, or how skepticism turned to advocacy when theory met reality, or simply how one woman refused to be talked out of knowledge she knew was true, then do me a favor, leave a like on this video. It helps other people find these stories. And these stories deserve to be found. The last recorded mention of Ingrid Larson comes from a letter she wrote to Thomas Brennan in 1894. 3 years after leaving the cabin, Brennan had written to tell her about a particularly harsh winter that had hit the valley, and about how every family with a refuge room had survived without incident, while several newer settlers, building only surface structures, had suffered badly. And Greed's reply was brief. I am glad to hear the work continues. My grandfather used to say that knowledge isn't truly yours until you've given it away. I thought I understood what he meant, but I was wrong. Knowledge doesn't belong to any of us. It belongs to everyone who needs it, including people we'll never meet. Building that cellar wasn't about saving my own life. It was about making sure the technique didn't die with me. Tell the new settlers they're welcome to visit if they want to learn. There's no charge for information that might keep their children alive. There never was. She died in 1896 at age 61 from pneumonia. Her obituary in the Stevensville Register ran 6 paragraphs, and mentioned the cellar only briefly in the 3rd paragraph. As one item in a list of her accomplishments, the writer apparently didn't grasp the significance, or perhaps he did and simply couldn't find words adequate to the achievement. Either way, the record is incomplete. The obituary tells us when she died, but not what she proved. It marks her passing, but not her legacy. It records the end of her life, but not the continuation of her work. For that, you have to go to Montana. You have to descend into a stone-walled room that still regulates temperature the way it did in 1873. You have to stand where 5 people survived a storm that killed 7 others. You have to touch walls built by a widow who trusted her grandfather's wisdom more than her neighbor's doubts, and you have to ask yourself, what knowledge are you carrying that others need? What techniques do you know that might save lives if shared? What wisdom are you holding back because people might call you foolish, improper, or wasteful? Ingrid Larson didn't have those answers when she started digging. She just had a memory of her grandfather's hands fitting stones together and a conviction that knowledge proven across 3 centuries might work for 3 more. She was right. The walls are still standing. The technique still works. And somewhere in Montana, someone is probably digging a cellar beneath their home, following instructions that trace back to a Norwegian valley through a widow's hands to this moment. This transfer of knowledge across time, that's not survival. That's legacy, and it's the only thing that lasts longer than stone.